My dad taught me to confess everything, even things I hadn't done. If I didn't admit to it, he'd find a way to punish me anyway. Throw away because this involves ongoing family drama and I don't want this traced back to me. I'm 24F and I've been in therapy for 2 years trying to understand why I automatically take blame for everything that goes wrong, even when I know I'm not responsible. My therapist suggested I write about my childhood to process what she calls learned helplessness and trained compliance. Turns out, my father's parenting method was basically psychological torture disguised as discipline. For context, my dad Marcus, 53M, is a retired police detective who worked in interrogations for most of his career. He was really good at his job, known for getting confessions out of suspects that other detectives couldn't crack. The problem is, he brought those same interrogation techniques home and used them on me and my twin sister Jasmine from the time we could walk. My parents divorced when Jasmine and I were 8, and we lived with Dad most of the time because Mom worked nights as a nurse and couldn't handle the custody schedule. Dad always said Mom was too soft on us and that we needed structure and accountability to become responsible adults. The confession sessions started when we were really young, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Anytime something went wrong in the house, a broken dish, spilled juice, missing item, anything, Dad would line Jasmine and me up in the living room for what he called investigation time. Someone broke Mom's favorite mug, he'd say, holding up the pieces. I know one of you did it. We're going to sit here until whoever did it tells the truth. At first, these sessions seemed normal. If one of us had actually broken something, we'd confess and get a reasonable punishment, maybe timeout or loss of TV privileges. But Dad wasn't satisfied with just solving actual crimes. He started creating scenarios where someone had to be guilty, even when neither of us had done anything wrong. The cookies are missing from the jar, he'd announce. I know one of you took them without permission. Jasmine and I would look at each other, confused, because neither of us had touched the cookies. Maybe Dad had eaten them, or Mom, or maybe he'd just forgotten buying them. But in Dad's mind, someone was always guilty. We're going to sit here until someone tells the truth, he'd say, settling into his interrogation posture. I have all day. And he meant it. These sessions would go on for hours. Dad would use classic interrogation techniques, good cop, bad cop, with himself playing both roles, false evidence, psychological pressure, isolation. He'd separate Jasmine and me, tell each of us that the other had already confessed, make up witnesses who had supposedly seen us do whatever we were accused of. Jasmine already told me you took the cookies, he'd tell me privately. She's trying to protect you, but I already know the truth. It'll be easier for everyone if you just admit it. Of course, Jasmine hadn't said anything because she hadn't done anything. But at 5 years old, I didn't understand that Dad was lying. I thought my sister had betrayed me, and I was terrified of the consequences of continuing to deny something that Dad was convinced I'd done. So I learned to confess. Okay, I took the cookies, I'd say, even though I hadn't. Dad would seem satisfied. Thank you for telling the truth. Now, what have we learned about taking things without permission? I'd get a lecture about honesty and respect, then punishment for the crime I hadn't committed. But the punishment for confessing was always lighter than what Dad threatened for continuing to lie. Liars get worse consequences than people who make mistakes and own up to them, he'd say. I respect people who tell the truth, even when it's hard. This became the pattern for everything. Missing homework, arguments with Jasmine, broken toys, messy rooms. Dad always assumed someone was guilty and would interrogate us until one of us confessed. Since Jasmine was more stubborn and would hold out longer, I usually broke first. I learned that confessing, even to things I hadn't done, was the path of least resistance. The interrogation would stop, the psychological pressure would end, and I'd just have to deal with whatever punishment came next. It was better than hours of being accused, isolated, and manipulated. By the time I was 8 or 9, I was confessing to things automatically. Dad would start to bring up something that had gone wrong, and I'd immediately say, "It was me. I'm sorry, you don't even know what I'm talking about yet," he'd say. "Whatever it is, I probably did it," I'd respond. Dad seemed proud of this. He'd tell people that I was extremely honest and took responsibility for my actions. He'd brag to other parents about how his daughters always confessed when they'd done something wrong. Most kids lie to their parents, he'd say. But my girls know better. They know I'll find out the truth anyway, so they might as well be honest from the start. What he didn't mention was that finding out the truth often meant fabricating evidence or wearing us down through psychological manipulation until someone confessed just to make it stop. The worst part was that Dad genuinely believed he was teaching us valuable life lessons. In his mind, he was preparing us for the real world, where actions have consequences and honesty is rewarded. He thought he was making us into people of character and integrity. But what he was actually doing was teaching me that authority figures always assume guilt, that denying wrongdoing is futile, and that confessing to things I hadn't done was often the safest option. The confession training escalated as Jasmine and I got older. By middle school, Dad had expanded his interrogation techniques to include what he called lifestyle accountability sessions. Every Sunday night, he'd sit us down for what he called weekly review. We'd have to confess to anything we'd done wrong during the past week: bad grades, arguing with each other, being disrespectful, not doing chores properly, anything. "This is your chance to come clean," he'd say. "I already know about most of it, but I want to see if you're going to be honest with me." The implication was always that he had surveillance or inside information about our behavior. Sometimes this was true. He'd talk to our teachers, coach, or other parents. But often, he was just fishing to see what we'd admit to. I learned to prepare for these sessions by mentally cataloging every possible thing I might have done wrong, no matter how minor. I'd confess to talking in class, forgetting to make my bed one morning, rolling my eyes when Jasmine annoyed me, having impure thoughts about boys, anything I could think of. "I appreciate your honesty," Dad would say after my confessions. "This is what integrity looks like." Jasmine, meanwhile, had developed a different strategy. She'd gotten better at withstanding Dad's interrogation techniques and would often refuse to confess to things she hadn't done. This led to much harsher punishments for her: longer groundings, loss of privileges, sometimes physical consequences like extra chores or exercise. Dad would tell her she was choosing the hard way, and that her punishments would be lighter if she'd just be honest like your sister. But Jasmine held her ground. "I'm not going to lie and say I did something I didn't do," she'd tell him. This made Dad furious. In his worldview, people who refused to confess were either guilty and lying, or they had character flaws that needed to be corrected through discipline. "Your sister is stubborn and prideful," he'd tell me. "She hasn't learned the value of humility and honesty. Don't be like her." The dynamic created a wedge between Jasmine and me. I was the good daughter who took responsibility for her actions, while she was the difficult one who made everything harder for the family. Dad would praise me for being mature and honest, while criticizing Jasmine for being defensive and uncooperative. But I was starting to realize that my confessions weren't making my life better. They were just making me complicit in my own punishment. I was taking blame for things that weren't my fault, accepting consequences I didn't deserve, and enabling Dad's need to always have someone to hold accountable. The breaking point came when I was 14. Dad's wallet went missing from his dresser, and he immediately called an investigation session. He was convinced that either Jasmine or I had taken money from it. "I had $60 in my wallet yesterday," he said. "Today there's only 20. Someone took $40, and we're going to figure out who." Neither Jasmine nor I had touched his wallet. I didn't even know he kept money in it. But Dad was absolutely certain that one of us was guilty. "This is theft," he said. "This is serious. Whoever did this is going to face serious consequences." He separated us for individual interrogation. When he questioned me, he used every technique I'd learned to recognize over the years. "I know you took the money," he said. "Jasmine already told me she saw you in my room yesterday." "I wasn't in your room," I said. "She's trying to protect you, but I already have the truth. It'll be better for you if you just admit it now." For the first time in my life, I held my ground. "Dad, I didn't take your money. I've never taken money from your wallet. I don't even know where you keep it. So you're calling your sister a liar?" "I'm saying I didn't do it." The interrogation went on for 3 hours. Dad used every psychological pressure technique he'd ever employed: isolation, false evidence, threats of escalating consequences, appeals to my previous honesty, everything. But I didn't confess because I genuinely hadn't done anything. Finally, Dad got frustrated and punished both of us. Since neither of you will tell the truth, you're both grounded for 2 weeks. No phone, no TV, no friends. Maybe that will motivate some honesty. 3 days later, Dad found his wallet in his car. He'd left it there after stopping for gas and had forgotten about it. All the money was accounted for. He never apologized to us for the false accusation or the punishment. Instead, he said, "Well, you were probably guilty of something else anyway. Consider this a learning experience." That's when I realized the system was rigged. Dad didn't actually care about truth or justice. He cared about control and compliance. He needed someone to blame when things went wrong, and he'd trained me to volunteer for that role. But he'd also revealed that even when I confessed to things I hadn't done, even when I took responsibility and accepted punishment, it didn't actually protect me from his suspicion and anger. The confession ritual was just a way for him to feel like he'd solved problems, not a way to make my life easier. High school was when I started to understand how abnormal our family dynamic was. I'd see how my friends interacted with their parents and realize that most families didn't operate like a police interrogation unit. When my friend Maya accidentally broke a plate at her house, her mom just said, "Accidents happen. Can you help me clean it up?" There was no investigation, no confession session, no lecture about responsibility and consequences. "Isn't your mom mad?" I asked. "Why would she be mad?" "It was an accident," Maya said, confused. I couldn't explain why that seemed strange to me without revealing how my family worked. I also started noticing how I reacted differently to authority figures than my peers did. When teachers asked who was talking in class, I'd immediately raise my hand even if I'd been silent. When my boss at my part-time job mentioned that someone had made an error, I'd volunteer that it was probably me. "Why do you always assume you're the one who did something wrong?" My friend Carlos asked after watching me apologize to a teacher for someone else's mistake. I didn't have a good answer. Taking blame just felt natural and safe. In relationships, the pattern was even more destructive. I'd apologize for things that weren't my fault, take responsibility for my boyfriend's bad moods, and confess to relationship problems that I hadn't created. "You don't have to apologize for everything," my first serious boyfriend Tyler told me. "It's weird how you blame yourself for stuff that has nothing to do with you." But I couldn't stop. When Tyler was stressed about work, I'd apologize for not being more supportive. When he was late to our dates, I'd apologize for making plans that were inconvenient for him. When he broke up with me junior year, I immediately asked what I'd done wrong and how I could fix it. "It's not anything you did," he said. "We're just not compatible. But honestly, dating you is exhausting because you take responsibility for everything. It makes me feel like I'm your dad or something." His comment about feeling like my dad hit harder than I expected. I was recreating the same dynamic with Tyler that I'd had with my father, constantly confessing, constantly apologizing, constantly taking blame to avoid conflict. Senior year, I started seeing the school counselor, Mrs. Patterson, about college applications. But our conversations kept drifting toward family dynamics and my tendency to blame myself for everything. "Tell me about how problems get solved in your family," she said during one session. I explained Dad's investigation sessions and confession rituals, thinking she'd be impressed by how thorough and fair the process was. Instead, she looked horrified. "Honey, that's not normal," she said gently. "Parents shouldn't interrogate their children like suspects. And you shouldn't have to confess to things you didn't do." "But Dad says honesty is important," I said. "He says taking responsibility builds character." "Taking responsibility for things you've actually done builds character," she clarified. "Being forced to confess to things you haven't done is something else entirely." She helped me understand that what I'd been calling honesty was actually coercion. That my father's interrogation techniques weren't teaching me integrity, they were teaching me to be compliant and submissive. "You've been trained to believe that someone always has to be blamed when something goes wrong," she said. "But that's not true. Sometimes things just happen. Sometimes no one is at fault." This was a revolutionary concept for me. I'd grown up believing that every problem had a guilty party and that denying responsibility was essentially lying. The idea that I could say, "I didn't do that," without being defensive or dishonest was completely foreign. Mrs. Patterson recommended that I continue counseling in college. "You've been conditioned to take blame as a survival mechanism," she said. "It'll take time to unlearn those patterns." When I told my parents I wanted to see a therapist in college, Dad's reaction was predictable. "What do you need therapy for?" he asked. "You've had a good childhood. We've given you structure and values." "I just want to work on some personal stuff," I said. "Like what?" "What personal stuff?" Even this conversation felt like an interrogation. Dad couldn't just accept that I wanted help. He needed to know exactly what I planned to discuss and whether it reflected poorly on his parenting. "Just normal college transition stuff," I said, which was partly true. Dad seemed suspicious but didn't push further. I think he was confident that any therapist would praise his parenting methods once they understood his approach. College therapy was revelation after revelation. My first therapist, Dr. Kim, helped me understand that my childhood had been emotionally abusive, even though Dad had never hit us and had genuinely believed he was helping us develop character. "Forced confessions are a form of psychological coercion," she explained. "What your father did was break down your sense of reality and teach you to doubt your own memory and experiences." She helped me recognize that I had symptoms of complex PTSD, hypervigilance around authority figures, automatic blame-taking, difficulty trusting my own perceptions, anxiety around conflict. These weren't character flaws or personality quirks. They were trauma responses. "You learn to confess as a survival mechanism," Dr. Kim said. "In your father's system, denial was punished more harshly than guilt. So you learned to be guilty, even when you weren't." The hardest part was realizing how deeply the confession training had affected my relationship with truth itself. I'd become so used to saying whatever would end conflict or satisfy authority figures that I sometimes genuinely didn't know what I actually thought or felt about things. "When someone asks you a question, what's your first instinct?" Dr. Kim asked. "To figure out what they want to hear," I admitted. "Not to figure out what's true." Truth feels risky. Working through this took years. I had to learn to sit with uncertainty instead of immediately taking blame. I had to practice saying, "I don't know," and "that wasn't me," without feeling like I was being defensive or dishonest. I also had to grieve the childhood I'd lost. While other kids were learning to trust their own perceptions and develop confidence, I'd been learning to doubt myself and defer to authority. I'd been robbed of the chance to develop a strong sense of self because I'd been too busy managing my father's need for control. The breakthrough came during my junior year when my roommate Stephanie accused me of using her shampoo without permission. My first instinct was to apologize and offer to buy her a new bottle, even though I had my own shampoo and hadn't touched hers. But something Dr. Kim had said came back to me. "You have the right to deny false accusations." "I didn't use your shampoo," I told Stephanie. "Are you sure?" "It's definitely less than it was yesterday." "I'm sure. I have my own shampoo." Stephanie looked annoyed. "Well, someone used it. Maybe you used more than you thought, or maybe it's evaporating, or maybe someone else used it. But it wasn't me." The conversation ended there. Stephanie didn't push for a confession, didn't interrogate me for hours, didn't punish me for denying the accusation. She just accepted that I'd said it wasn't me and moved on. It was such a small thing, but it felt revolutionary. I had denied a false accusation and nothing terrible had happened. The world hadn't fallen apart. I hadn't been labeled as defensive or dishonest. I'd just told the truth and been believed. That incident gave me courage to start pushing back against false accusations in other areas of my life. When my boss at my campus job suggested that I'd been late for my shift, I hadn't. I checked the time clock and showed him that I'd actually been early. When a professor implied that I'd plagiarized part of a paper, I hadn't. I showed him my research notes and drafts to prove my work was original. Each time I successfully defended myself against false accusations, I got a little bit stronger and a little bit more confident in my right to tell the truth. But the hardest test came during winter break of my senior year when I went home for Christmas. Dad had mellowed somewhat since Jasmine and I had left for college, but his basic personality hadn't changed. Within hours of being home, he'd found something to blame me for. Apparently, I'd left a light on in my room when I'd left for school in August. I've been paying extra on the electric bill for months because of your carelessness, he said. Old me would have immediately apologized and offered to pay the extra cost. New me took a breath and thought about whether this was actually something I needed to take responsibility for. Dad, I left for college 4 months ago. If there was a light on in my room all this time, why didn't you or Mom just turn it off? He looked surprised. That's not the point. The point is that you left it on. I don't think I did, but even if I had, it seems like the easy solution would have been to turn it off rather than leave it on for 4 months. Dad's expression shifted to the one I remembered from childhood interrogations. Are you arguing with me about this? I'm just saying I don't think I left a light on, and I don't think I should be responsible for 4 months of electric bills when the solution was to flip a switch. So you're not going to take responsibility for this? The question hung in the air like a challenge. This was the moment where old me would have crumbled and confessed to avoid conflict. I'm not going to take responsibility for something I don't think I did, I said. Dad stared at me for a long moment. I could see him calculating whether to escalate to full interrogation mode. But I wasn't a scared child anymore, and he seemed to sense that his old techniques might not work. College has made you disrespectful, he finally said, and walked away. That was it. No hours-long interrogation, no punishment, no forced confession. He just let it go. I realized that Dad's power over me had always been based on my willingness to submit to his process. When I stopped playing along, when I stopped volunteering for the role of guilty party, the whole system fell apart. Today, I'm 24 and I've been no contact with my father for about 6 months. The final break came when he tried to blame me for my sister Jasmine's decision to elope instead of having a traditional wedding. If you'd been a better example of family loyalty, maybe Jasmine would have wanted to include us in her wedding, he told me during a phone call. Dad, Jasmine's wedding decisions have nothing to do with me, I said. Everything is connected, he said. Your attitude influences your sister's attitude. That's not true, and I'm not taking responsibility for Jasmine's choices. So you're just going to abandon your family? The conversation devolved from there, with Dad using every manipulation technique in his arsenal to try to get me to accept blame for Jasmine's wedding, my parents' disappointment, and the general family dysfunction. But I'd learned to recognize these techniques for what they were. I wasn't going to confess to ruining family dynamics that had been unhealthy long before Jasmine's wedding plans. I told Dad that I needed space from our relationship and that I wouldn't be taking calls from him for a while. He responded by sending emails listing all the ways I'd been a disappointment as a daughter and demanding that I take accountability for my actions. I didn't respond to the emails. For the first time in my life, I let Dad's accusations go unanswered. I didn't confess, didn't apologize, didn't take responsibility for his feelings or the family situation. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time. Jasmine has been supportive of my decision to distance myself from Dad. She never learned to confess the way I did, so she's always been better at maintaining boundaries with him. But she understands why it took me longer to break free from his manipulation. You were just trying to survive, she told me. You learned to give him what he wanted so he'd leave you alone. But you don't have to do that anymore. I'm still in therapy, still working on trusting my own perceptions and standing up for myself. It's hard to unlearn 24 years of conditioning, but I'm getting better at it. The biggest challenge is romantic relationships. I still have the instinct to take blame for my partner's moods and problems, to confess to relationship issues that aren't my fault, to apologize for having needs or boundaries. My current boyfriend Nathan has been patient with me as I work through these patterns. When I automatically apologize for things that aren't my fault, he gently points it out. Why are you apologizing for the restaurant being crowded? He'll ask. You didn't make all these people decide to eat here tonight. He's helped me see how exhausting it must be to be in a relationship with someone who takes responsibility for everything, including things that are completely outside their control. I'm learning that healthy relationships involve shared responsibility, not one person taking blame for everything that goes wrong. I'm learning that I can say, I don't know, that wasn't me, and I disagree, without being defensive or dishonest. Most importantly, I'm learning that my worth as a person isn't tied to my willingness to confess and accept punishment. I can be a good person while also defending myself against false accusations. Dad might have thought he was teaching me valuable lessons about honesty and accountability. But what he actually taught me was that truth is negotiable, that authority figures can't be trusted, and that survival sometimes requires sacrificing your integrity. It's taken years of therapy to undo that damage and learn to value truth over compliance. But I'm finally at a place where I can say, I didn't do that, and mean it, even when someone in authority insists that I must be lying. The confession sessions are over. I'm done volunteering to be guilty. TLDR. My police detective father used professional interrogation techniques on me and my twin sister throughout our childhood, forcing us to confess to things we hadn't done. I learned to automatically take blame for everything to avoid hours of psychological manipulation. It took years of therapy to unlearn this pattern and develop the ability to defend myself against false accusations. I'm now no contact with my father after refusing to take responsibility for family problems I didn't create.